Up to you.
All right, let me turn it a little.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, that's much better. Okay.
put the headphones back on. All right, let's go.
Okay. Three, two, one. Our guest today is Jim DiEugenio. Jim DiEugenio is the author of Destiny Betrayed, Reclaiming Parkland, The JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today, JFK Revisited, and he co authored his most recent book, The JFK Assassination Chokeholds. He's also the co author and editor of The Assassinations, Probe magazine on JFK, MLK, RFK, and Malcolm X. He co edited Probe magazine from 1993 to 2000 and was a guest commentator on the anniversary issue of the film JFK, released by Warner Brothers in 2013. Jim, who has an MA in Contemporary American History from California State University Northridge, is also a specialist in the history and theory of cinema and has written numerous film reviews. He is a regular contributor at his Substack, James Anthony DiEugenio. He has appeared as a guest on numerous talk shows and is a regular on Lynn Osanik's Black Op Radio. Jim's website is kennedysandking.com. Jim DiEugenio, welcome to the Bruce Collins Show.
Nice to be here.
It's an honor to have you on. Now, as a way of introducing yourself, can you explain how you became involved in JFK assassination research?
Okay, this is a kind of long story, but I'll try and summarize it in a
Okay.
kind of concise kind of a way. All right. Uh, for many years, I had dabbled in the JFK case. Not really seriously. Every once in a while, I would pick up a book or read an interview or something like that. And when I came to California to go to film school, my partner at that time said, "Why don't you write a screenplay?" And I said, "About what?" And he said, "Well, what do you think would be an interesting picture?" Okay. Uh, and I said, "Well, what about the JFK assassination?" And he goes, "Well, how are you going to tell the story?" I said, "There's only one way to tell the story, and you got to go through this guy down in New Orleans, this Jim Garrison guy." Okay. So I started working on what's called a film treatment, which is like a paragraph by paragraph storyline. All right. And so one morning, I go down to the newsstand and pick up Variety magazine, and there it is. Oliver Stone has purchased Jim Garrison's book on the trail of the assassins, and so poof, that was it. I knew I wasn't going to beat him to the market. Okay, and so what I did then is I transferred the work I had done and expanded it into a book, and that's the first edition of Destiny Betrayed, which I don't recommend anybody read because it's by far my worst book. Okay, the second edition of Destiny Betrayed is probably my best book. Okay, so that and let me explain why. See, the difference between the first and second book is that the review board was constructed in the interim. And so, therefore, I got to work from all of these declassified documents, which was like night and day. Should I explain what the review board was?
No, that's okay. We can.
Okay. Anyway,
So,
they unleashed about 2 million pages of documents, and a lot of them had to deal with New Orleans and Garrison and what the CIA did down there, and people like Clay Shaw and David Ferry and Guy Bannister, and therefore That's why that's a much better book than the first edition.
So Jim, that's a perfect segue. You're speaking about New Orleans, and we know Lee Harvey Oswald settled in New Orleans for some time. Can you explain the significance of 544 Camp Street in New Orleans and its connection to Oswald and Guy Bannister?
All right. This is some people would say that this is the sort of like the Rosetta Stone of the Kennedy case. All right. Um, and by the way, the pamphlet you're talking about that has 544 Camp Street stamped on it, okay, if you can believe it, that's in the Warren Commission volumes. It's in, I think, volume 25. All right. But somehow the Warren Commission never figured out what is this 544 Camp Street. Okay. so, and so there was Oswald down there in Canal Street leafleting with this flyer. Actually, it's a pamphlet that he stamped 544 Camp Street on. And he actually passed it out to people. All right. The problem is, of course, is that 544 Camp Street was the office of Guy Bannister. So here you had this incredible dichotomy of a guy who's supposed to be a Marxist, all right, sympathizing with Fidel Castro. And on the other hand, you have this office of this right wing nut, Guy Bannister. Now, to say the guy is a right wing nut is probably doesn't do him justice because he was pretty much a fascist. All right. Some would call him a neo Nazi. In fact, he visited with George Rockwell, who was the president of the Nazi Party in the United States. Rockwell was right in Bannister's office. All right. Now, how do we know that Oswald was actually at Bannister's office? Because we have several witnesses who actually saw him walk in to the office. All right. We have the Campbell brothers, Dan and Tom Campbell, who worked as student agent provocateurs for Bannister. And they both saw Oswald there. All right. And then we have Roberts, who was Bannister's secretary. All right. And she told the House Select Committee. And by the way, that is one of the documents, that interview with Bannister's secretary. All right. That was one of the documents that was not declassified until the review board declassified it. I believe that was in 1997. All right. And she said that Oswald walked in to Bannister's office one day. Okay, she had never seen him before. Now, she furthered this in her interview with Anthony Summers later, okay, in which he said that not only she saw Oswald there, but her daughter saw Oswald there. All right, and further that Bannister had given Oswald an office there where he would do a lot of his printing, okay, of the flyers he would pass out. So, how do you explain something like this? Well, the only way to explain it is as Jim Garrison explained it, that Oswald was not really a communist, that he was really working as an agent provocateur, okay, for either the CIA or the FBI or maybe both. All right. What is an agent provocateur? It's somebody who disguises himself as something he is not in order to create problems for the organization that he's imposing on. And in this case, of course, it would be the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. All right, this leftist leaning, Castro sympathizing organization that originated, I believe, back in 1960 or 61 out of New York City. All right, and included some celebrities like Norman Mailer on it. Okay, and they were sympathizing with the Castro Revolution. And the CIA, as early as 1961, had set up a campaign against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And people like David Phillips and James McCord were a part of this infiltration and the uh, propaganda attempt to smear the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which, by the way, worked. And by 1963, even before the Kennedy assassination, the FPCC was not nearly what it was when it first started out. So this is the significance of the 544 Camp Street flyer.
Now, Jim, I understand an Oswald imposter or maybe imposters were spotted at multiple locations before the assassination, such as in Mexico City. That seems odd. Why do you think this was done?
Well, if I can, let me do a little commercial.
Sure.
In this book that I contributed to, the JFK Assassination Chokeholds, Matt Crumpton wrote what I believe to be the best, the most current, and the definitive examination of all the Oswald impersonations that took place in 1962 and 1963. He enumerates 21, let me say that again, 21 reports of
Wow.
Oswald impersonations, okay, which is really kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. All right. Now, many of these took place in the run-up to Kennedy's assassination. All right. And many of them were designed in order to incriminate Oswald, okay, in advance. For example, there were sightings of Oswald at a target range, all right, where he was actually firing at somebody else's target, okay, and he was doing pretty well. When we know, of course, Oswald was not a very good shot, okay, and he actually said things on the target range like, oh, I thought that was Kennedy when he hit the wrong target, all right. And then there was one at a car lot, okay, in which he actually gave out the name of Oswald. Whoever was impersonating Oswald actually gave out the name of Oswald, okay, and he wanted to send some items, some transportation items, trucks, over to Cuba. Then there was another car lot one where this was later on, I believe, in 1963, at a Mercury sales office, in which he test drove a car and he went at 60 miles an hour on a city street. And he told the guy he was going to be coming into some money. Okay. All right. Now, these things, there's simply too many of them to ignore.
Right.
Okay. You simply can't ignore all these instances. The one you're talking about took place in Mexico City in late September, early October of 1963. These took place at both the Soviet embassy and the Cuban embassy. All right. Now, what makes these so interesting, some would say compelling, is that outside both embassies, the CIA had placed a bank of cameras. All right.
Hmm.
I believe there were three outside the Cuban embassy, and there were two outside the Soviet embassy. In addition to this, the CIA had bugged the embassy offices. All right. I believe that they had both bugged the office and tapped the telephone. All right. Now, since Oswald went in to the Cuban embassy three times and the Soviet embassy twice, there should be a record of it.
Right.
Okay. You should have, at the very least, 10 pictures of Oswald because he went in and he went out a total of five times. So there should be 10 pictures. Now, one of the cameras that the CIA used outside the Cuban embassy was what they called pulse activated. What that means is that it was sensitive to the air pressure change when a door would open and close. Now, can you get more foolproof than that? Okay, I don't think so. There are none. There are no pictures of Oswald going in or coming out of either embassy. All right.
Okay.
And today we have the actual um, the monitoring of the camera bases, and they actually say negative. That was declassified by the ARB. The CIA was very, very puzzled about this. All right. They down there in Mexico City, they were going crazy. Okay. How could we have missed this guy? But it's not just that. It's the sound tape. Because the night of the assassination, the CIA sent an audio tape of what they said was Oswald's voice in the Cuban embassy up to Dallas because Oswald was in detention. The FBI agents who listened to the tape, who were interrogating Oswald, said the man on the tape is not the man we're interrogating. So, in other words, there was no audio tape and there was no picture of Oswald down in Mexico City. Further, the person who had the most interaction with Oswald was a woman named Sylvia Duran. She was a receptionist at the Cuban embassy. During the House Select Committee hearings, she was asked, okay, to describe the guy she talked to said he was Oswald. He was short and blonde. Oswald was average height and he did not have blonde hair.
Right.
Okay. So when they interviewed the rest, four out of the five people inside the Cuban embassy said it was not Oswald when they were shown pictures of Oswald. All right. Further, when the House Select Committee talked to the translators who did the translations of the tapes, they said that the guy spoke poor Russian and good Spanish. Oswald spoke good Russian and he spoke poor Spanish. So it's like a complete inverse of what we should have. So then the question becomes, why why was there impersonation of Oswald in Mexico City? And it seems to be that the CIA wanted to tell a tale about an Oswald who was at the end of his rope, okay, who thought the FBI was following him around, all right, and he got into contact with a guy named Kostakov, Valery Kostakov, at the Russian embassy, and it turns out that Kostakov was supposed to be, now I'm saying supposed to be because this has been disputed later, all right, the head of black operations for the KGB in the Western Hemisphere. Now, it doesn't get very much more incriminating than that because then, of course, the imputation is that Oswald shot Kennedy for the Russians. All right. All right. Now, all this stuff about Oswald not being in Mexico City was not declassified, at least not declassified fully, until the review board came out. And the reason it was not declassified fully is that when the House Select Committee went in to meet with the CIA about the Mexico City report written by Ed Lopez and Dan Hardway, Eddie Lopez told me, Jim, you know why the report was not included in the House Select Committee volumes? And I said, no, I'd like to find out. The first day, me and Danny and Blakey, who was the chief counsel, went in to meet with the CIA guys. There were three of them across the table from us. It took us 8 hours to get through the first 2 pages.
Wow.
They objected to every sentence. Okay? Now, why did they object to every sentence? Because the first part of the report describes the camera coverage outside the Soviet and Cuban embassies. That's why. They did not want it to let out that all these cameras missed Oswald either going in or coming out of the embassies. They didn't want to let that information out. Okay?
Mhm.
All right. And so that is probably the most provocative impersonation of Oswald was down there in Mexico City.
Hmm. Fascinating. Now, let's go to Dealey Plaza. Let's take a look there. Various significant witnesses in Dealey Plaza were ignored. I understand false Secret Service agents were reported by law enforcement officers immediately after the assassination. And there were other suspicious events, such as the presence of David Atlee Phillips in Dallas immediately prior to November 22nd. What is your assessment of what actually happened in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963?
Well, first of all, that motorcade should have never gone through Dealey Plaza.
Yeah.
Okay? It was one of the most disastrous choices. And the Secret Service performance really was a disaster that day. Okay? But it was one of the worst things about that whole trip was the choice to have Kennedy go through what were two sharp turns within the space of one city block. Why was that? Because, first of all, you have to decrease speed when you're negotiating these sharp turns. So at some points in Dealey Plaza, the car was down to like 11 miles an hour, all right, which is a no no.
Yeah.
If you take a look at the Secret Service manual, they want the car going at about 30 miles an hour, okay, and that's the low end, all right. Secondly, you had a tall building right behind the car, the Texas School Book Depository, all right. Thirdly, you had this rolling hill right in front of the car called the grassy knoll. And to top it off, you had a stockade fence on the grassy knoll. Okay. You also had ease of exit because there's a parking lot behind the grassy knoll and behind the Texas School Book Depository. All right. So this was simply inexcusable. And the House Select Committee, of course, found out that this was not the only way to get to the trademark, which was the eventual destination that Kennedy was going to give a speech at. You could have gone another route avoiding this. So, why this was chosen has been a mystery that has never ever been solved. All right? Okay, now, on top of this, there was no support for the Secret Service. In other words, there was no supplementary protection. In other words, the sheriff's office, the Dallas police office, the military intelligence from San Antonio, which should have been there. Okay. None of those none of those supplemented the Secret Service. And you can look at films. There's no people on the ground. There's no people on the rooftops. There's no radio transmission in order to say there's an open window. Okay, get up there and get the window shut. None of that happened. None of that happened, which is really inexplicable. All right? All right. Now, on top of this, you have what's called in the military the perfect setup for what's called an L-shaped ambush. And these military guys have told me, we rehearse these things. All right. What you have is an upside down L. Okay. With the short side up on Houston Street and the long side up on Elm Street. So therefore, you have three places you can place the hit team. Okay, up on top of the grassy knoll, over there in the Texas School Book Depository, and the Dow Tex building is right across the street from the Texas. And so you have a perfect L-shaped ambush where you can put three hit teams. You can't miss, okay, with that kind of coverage. All right. Then you have this phenomenon of people claiming they're Secret Service agents in Dealey Plaza that day, when in fact all the Secret Service agents had hightailed it to Parkland Hospital, where JFK's body had been taken afterwards. Okay. The FBI never did a chronicle of all the eye and ear witnesses, which is really incredible when you think about it. That should have been one of the very first things that the FBI should have done, was to set up a master list of all the eyewitnesses and the ear witnesses with summaries of their testimony. But this was not done. And in fact, I don't think it's ever been done. So what happened is that certain private researchers, like Josiah Thompson, did what they could to try and put together, a series of witnesses and what they heard or what they saw. Now, what they came up with, of course, was things like pictures of people running over to the grassy knoll. Immediately after the volley, you had many, many witnesses running over to the grassy knoll, and you had witnesses who actually saw smoke at the grassy knoll. All right, and a guy named Sam Holland, who Josiah Thompson made uh, a kind of very strong feature part of his book, 6 Seconds in Dallas. Thompson interviewed Holland, and Holland said the shots sounded like they came from under the trees behind the stockade fence. And so he ran over there right after, and he wasn't the only one. He named 6 or 7 other people who ran over there with him, okay, to the grassy knoll area. And not only did he see the smoke and hear the noise, but he said when he got over there it had been raining that morning, and behind the fence he saw these fresh footprints, like they were going back and forth in this same area. Okay, all right. So this is the kind of scenario that you have. You had people who heard shots from the front and heard shots from the back, strongly indicating that there was some kind of a crossfire in Dealey Plaza that day. Now, what the Warren Commission did with this material was simply a disgrace, okay, in every single aspect that you can imagine. All right. They ended up saying that all the shots came from the back, okay, and that all the important witnesses heard shots from the rear. Now, how did they get away with this? Because they never talked about the Zapruder film. Okay, in the 888-page report, they don't talk about Kennedy's reaction in the Zapruder film. All right, the Zapruder film, of course, is the most important film taken that day. All right, and because it is taken from the front, a slightly side angle, all right, and it reveals at frame Z313 all the I mean, everybody who watches the film says that Kennedy is hit from the front and his body ricochets backward with such force that it almost bounces off. Well, it does bounce off the rear seat. And then you have Jacqueline Kennedy, her face contorted with horror as she's looking at her husband, and she reaches back to the trunk of the car. And it was later she said she was obviously having a panic attack. Part of his skull had ejected out the back seat, okay, and she was retrieving it. And then you have Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who, by the way, is the only Secret Service agent who reacts to the first volley. And he runs up from the follow up car, all right, and he pushes her back into the car and then covers those two bodies with his as the car drives to the Parkland Hospital. All right. So that is the general scenario of what happens in Dealey Plaza, which has all the indications of being Kennedy caught in a crossfire.
Yeah. Again, we're speaking today with Jim DiEugenio. His Substack is James Anthony DiEugenio. His latest book he co authored is The JFK Assassination Chokeholds. And you can find more information on Jim DiEugenio on his website, kennedysandking.com. Now, Jim, 40 professional witnesses at Parkland Hospital went on record that they witnessed a massive hole in the back of the president's head after he was shot, indicating a shot from the front, as you've been talking about. Yet the autopsy documentation gives a different description. What happened, and who do you feel drove this deception?
Well, let me clarify that opening statement.
Okay.
When the review board declassified the medical investigation of the House Select Committee, they found that, contrary to what's in Volume 7, page 37 of the House Select Committee report, that there was no difference between what the witnesses at Parkland saw and what the witnesses at Bethesda saw. And so Dr. Gary Aguilar compiled this list. It turns out that combined, both locations, 42 witnesses reported an avulsive, gaping hole, baseball-sized hole, in the back of Kennedy's skull. All right? Now, when you have a baseball-sized hole in the rear of your skull, that's strongly indicative of a shot from the front, because everyone, any familiar with ballistics, will tell you that entrance hole, that leaves a small penetrating wound, okay? Whereas once the bullet passes through flesh and muscle and blood, it forces its way out, okay, and leaves a much larger, what's called an avulsive hole, as it exits. All right? So this is strongly indicative of a shot from the front. All right? Now, here's the problem. In the autopsy report, okay, and in the pictures taken, they do everything they can in order to disguise the condition of Kennedy's body when it arrived at Bethesda that night. All right? But finally, when the review board interviewed Dr. Boswell, okay, and he was one of the three pathologists at Bethesda that night, he gave some indications that there was such a hole, and that the picture that they had used a flap from Kennedy's skull, which had torn open, all right, to cover up this large hole in the back of Kennedy's head. So finally, something like 34 years later, we finally got an explanation of why there's a supposed difference between what the witnesses saw versus what's in the pictures and also what's in the report. Okay? I cannot stress enough how much pressure was put on those doctors that night at Bethesda Medical Center. Because although Oliver Stone was pilloried for depicting the autopsy with the military guy there saying, I'm in charge. That's exactly what happened. That is what happened. And how do we know that? We know that because the third autopsy doctor, the first one was Humes, second was Boswell, third was Pierre Fink. Pierre Fink testified at the trial of Clay Shaw down in New Orleans in 1969. Okay. When he was cross examined on the stand by Garrison's staff, they asked him about this. And he ended up testifying on the record. There were a lot of military guys there that night. And at one time, and they were interfering with the autopsy. They were actually interfering with the autopsy.
Wow.
Okay? Because they would not allow a dissection of Kennedy's back wound. They didn't allow it, and you're supposed to do that. When you dissect a wound, that means you track it. You take out all the excess blood and tissue, and you track the path of the wound. That wasn't done in this case. And Fink said that it was because of these military guys. And Humes got so frustrated that he actually said, who's in charge here? And some general said, I am. Okay? So this is why the autopsy of President Kennedy is so terrible. Okay? It's,
Hmm.
I mean, look, you did not dissect the back wound, number one. Number two, you did not section the brain. And the reason you section the brain is that you want to trace the path of the bullets through the brain tissue. That wasn't done. Third, Kennedy's brain was not weighed that night. Let me say that again. Kennedy's brain was not weighed that night. And why is that so important? Because when it was finally weighed, which was a weeks later, it came in at 1,500 grams. Why is that so unusual? Because that's 160 grams over the average weight of a male brain.
Hmm.
The average weight is about 1,340 grams. How can Kennedy's brain weigh more than the average? And the reason I ask that is because, first of all, the blood tissue was all over the back of the
Right.
car. You can
Right.
see that from pictures. It's all over Jackie Kennedy's suit. Okay? You watch his Zapruder film. Kennedy's head explodes. Okay, in that film. How on earth can his brain weigh more than the average? All right? Under those circumstances. And this is why in our film, JFK Revisited, okay, we have several doctors, including a neurologist, Dr. Mike Chesser, okay, who all come to the conclusion that whatever brain came in at 1,500 grams, it wasn't Kennedy's brain. Okay, it couldn't have been Kennedy's brain. All right. So this horrible, disgusting autopsy that Kennedy got that night.
Hmm. Now, Admiral George Burkley was Kennedy's personal physician, and he was present at Parkland Hospital. And if I'm not mistaken, he seemed to have knowledge before his death that he took to his grave. So, would we say that that was also the CIA probably shut him down?
All right. Well, George Burkley was Kennedy's personal physician. Not only was he at Parkland, he was at Bethesda. I believe he was the only doctor who was at both locations. Through time and various interviews, he gave some very provocative information out. In 1964, when he was interviewed by the Kennedy Library, they asked him about the three bullet scenario in the Warren Commission. Burkley said words to the effect, I'd rather not comment on that. Okay. Then, for the House Select Committee, he wrote a letter to the first chief counsel, Richard Sprague, all right, in which he stated words to the effect, I have some interesting information that I think you should have. Words, some like vague but rather provocative insinuation about it. Well, what happened then is that later on during the second chief counselship, that all changed. They didn't even do an in depth interview with Burkley,
Hmm.
they let him submit a summary. Okay. Then, when the ARB wanted to take a look at Burkley's files, he had passed on by then. They wrote a letter to his daughter, and his daughter replied to the first letter, oh, sure, sure, be glad to. I'll talk to his attorney's office and they'll let you in. Well, when the time came to actually allow the visitation, suddenly this all changed. It all changed. No, no, I'm sorry. That would not be in keeping with my father's wishes. So how do you explain this stuff? You know, I mean, is there an innocent way to explain this stuff? I don't think so. I think George Burkley took the secrets of Kennedy's assassination to his grave, and I don't think it was his idea. And by the way, somebody who knew Burkley and lived in his neighborhood told me years later. He said, Jim, every year towards the end of Burkley's life, the Secret Service would visit him
Hmm.
annually at around the
Wow.
same time. Okay? So clearly, they looked at George Burkley as this could be a giant hole. Okay? All right. And we don't want that hole to break open. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're getting visits every year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jim Garrison was the district attorney for Orleans Parish in Louisiana, and of course, we know the JFK movie by Oliver Stone. He was played by Kevin Costner. Now, in 1969, as a result of his investigation of the Kennedy assassination, he believed there was a conspiracy involving the CIA, the mafia, and other organizations. In the only attempt to bring charges against potential perpetrators, he brought charges against Clay Shaw. Tell us about that event, your evaluation of it, and the actions of the CIA because of it.
Well, in 1967, I believe it was in March, Garrison indicted Clay Shaw as part of a conspiracy to kill the president. All right. The problem with Garrison's case at that time was that Guy Bannister was dead. David Ferrie would die in February of 1967 under rather, let's say, hazy circumstances. All right. Leaving two unsigned suicide notes. All right. Uh, and so Garrison was left with Clay Shaw without the two supporting witnesses. All right. Now, on top of that, a whole massive force of the establishment was mounted against him. What do I mean by that? That what I mean by that is this: both the media, the MSM, the FBI, and the CIA was all opposed to what Garrison was doing, and they made no bones about it. All right, the media went after Garrison mercilessly. All right, it was really kind of ridiculous. All right, in the summer of 1967, you had two TV specials broadcast within a week or so of each other, if I recall correctly. One by CBS, one by NBC. The NBC show was a straight out hatchet job. It was produced by Walter Sheridan, who used to work for the National Security Agency, and he was consulting with the CIA. And the CIA actually funneled money into the production through the CIA station in New Orleans. That was originally supposed to be a two-parter, okay? But it was cut down to one. All right. This was a straight hatchet job on Garrison. Now, the other one was the four-part extravaganza put together by CBS, hosted by Cronkite and Dan Rather. All right. That was the most expensive documentary that CBS ever put together. All right. And every major tenet of the Warren Commission, they ended up backing. All right. 4 hours of this stuff. What chance did Garrison have? On top of that, you had stories in Newsweek. You had stories in the Saturday Evening Post. Okay. All right. You had an incessant barrage of the major newspapers, which is the Post, the LA Times, and the New York Times at that time. All right. And Garrison was essentially being pummeled. You also had in September of 1967, the CIA put together a task force against Garrison, which I described in my book, the second edition of Destiny Betrayed. And this was consisting of obstruction. In other words, they were going to block his subpoenas. All right. And they did. Infiltration. They had several agents in Garrison's office. A guy named Bill Boxley was one of the main ones. Surveillance. Gordon Novell wired his office for sound, as did the FBI also. Okay. Novell did it for NBC and the CIA. And the FBI sent in two specialists who worked with the phone company to wire his phones. All right. This went on all the way to the trial of Clay Shaw. They were also trying to flip Garrison's witnesses. All right, we have documentation on this now. All right, and so by the time Garrison got to trial, and by the way, Shaw's lawyers were in on this. They were cooperating with the CIA and the FBI. They were taking any kind of help they could. All right, and the CIA recruited lawyers in New Orleans to defend the other people that Garrison had called in for interviews. There was a cleared CIA panel of lawyers, which included Clay Shaw's boss, at the International Trade Mart, a guy named Lloyd Cobb. All right. Now, Shaw's lawyers extended and extended and extended the trial date. It took almost 2 years. And the reason they did this is because they wanted more and more time to go ahead and decimate Garrison's case before it got to trial. And this went as far as attacks, physical attacks on Garrison's witnesses. Richard Case Nagel had a hand grenade thrown at him in New York City. All right. Aloysius Habekorst, very important witness to Shaw using the alias of Bertrand, was almost run over by a truck the night before he was to testify. Clyde Johnson was beaten to a pulp, okay, and was in the hospital at the time he was supposed to testify. Now that case is very interesting because Garrison hid Johnson. He wasn't in New Orleans. He hid him outside the city at a college dorm someplace. But this is how infiltrated Garrison's office was, that they found him. All right. And they had physically assaulted him. So, as Garrison says in his book, he was sort of like the fisherman and the old man in the sea. You know, that he was cast out into the lake to do all these fish, but then they would be eaten alive, you know, on the way back. All right. And so this is what happened to his case. It turned out that Clay Shaw was lying his head off. Clay Shaw lied about everything on the stand. All right. He lied about not knowing Ferry. He lied about not using an alias. Okay. He lied about not being in Clinton and Jackson, those two small boroughs about 100 miles northeast of New Orleans. All right. He lied about not being associated with the CIA. All right. So, on every major point, Clay Shaw took the stand and committed perjury. All right. And this is why Garrison indicted him for committing perjury. But then that case was thrown out after it was transferred to a federal court. So that is what happened with Jim Garrison's case against Clay Shaw. All right. Clay Shaw did participate in these maneuverings of Oswald in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. And he very likely did it at the request of the CIA. To give you one indication, Clay Shaw's right-hand man was a guy named Jesse Core at the International Trade Mart. Jesse Core just happened to walk by Oswald on Canal Street when Oswald was doing his leafleting with the 544 Camp Street flyer. He picked one up, brought it back to the Trade Mart, and he noticed the 544 Camp Street address. He drew an arrow to the address and sent it to the FBI. I mean, can you get any more incriminating than that?
Yeah.
Okay. That Jesse Core is saying, wait a minute, this guy's blowing his cover. Okay.
Yeah. You know, this has been fantastic. I know our hour is almost up, so I want to ask you two really quick questions. One is Representative Anna Paulina Luna keeping you and your peers apprised of what is being found as a result of her committee's investigation? Is there any hope of finding the original uncut Zapruder film, the Orville Nix film, or of any CIA documents disclosing what actually happened, such as the CIA Miami Field Office after action report?
I live in California. Okay.
Mhm.
She's over there in Washington. So I'm not in close contact with Luna. All right. The people there in Washington, like Chad Nagel and Jeff Morley, are more in contact with her. I understand they're working on a final report, but I don't know what's in it.
Okay.
Okay. And I'm not sure if she subpoenaed these things. All right. So I wouldn't really know for a fact
Okay.
how she's progressing.
Okay. So, last question. Are you working on anything new regarding JFK? Number one. Number two, tell us about your website, kennedysandking.com. What will people find there? And also talk about your Substack, James Anthony DiEugenio.
All right. On kennedysandking.com, we try and keep current with the newest discoveries in the JFK case because the MSM is never going to tell you this stuff. We have going up right now, for example, a three-parter on how the CIA and the FBI thwarted the review board. In other words, why are we still trying to figure out all the documents when they should have been declassified in 2017? And that's true. They should have been declassified by law in 2017. It says it right there in the act. But we don't have all the documents. Why? Okay, and so this article by Andrew Eiler and Mark Adamczyk tries to explain why that's happening. So that's what Kennedy and King is about. Now, my Substack is more about, I do write a little about the Kennedy case, but I try and write about other current events. I just finished a four-parter on Trump and Iran, okay, and I'm going to be doing a review of the new documentary by Alex Gibney about Benjamin Netanyahu, okay? All right, so that's what my Substack is more about. It's more about cultural issues and current events. Okay, if you want to be up to date on the Kennedy case, go to kennedysandking.com. If you want to be my views on current events and culture, go over to my Substack, James Anthony DiEugenio.
Excellent. Jim DiEugenio, this has been eye-opening and a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope I can talk to you again sometime.
Thank you. I'll be glad to.
Great. Okay, we're all set. Thanks, Jim.